I'm Chance Dorland, and this is In Depth, an interview program from ExpressNews.com with in-depth reporting and other resources for stories affecting San Antonio and Bexar County. San Antonio Express News staff writer Emilie Eaton is following the news that the San Antonio Police Department is ready to start citing, rather than arresting, people accused of some low-level misdemeanors, including possession of small amounts of marijuana. And she joins me now to dive deeper into this subject. So great to have you back here on the program, Emilie. Let's start off with the basics. When and how was this SAPD announcement made?
This announcement was made on Tuesday at City Council's Public Safety Committee meeting. Chief McManus briefed City Council about the efforts to implement a cite and release program here in San Antonio and Bexar County. And he basically outlined how the district attorney's office had started a program a year ago where they would start giving tickets or citations rather than taking an individual to jail if that person was caught for certain misdemeanors. So that could include small possessions of marijuana, but that also could include graffiti, possession of synthetic marijuana, criminal mischief, theft, and theft of service. Theft of service is essentially when you dine and dash from a restaurant. So the chief outlined that his officers were now ready to start implementing this program if the new DA gets his policy enacted in January once he takes office.
And we'll actually hear some audio from Chief McManus a little later in today's episode and also touch on a few points that you've just mentioned. But I'm interested here in some more details about the exact topic we're now discussing. So what happens when someone gets caught with a small amount of marijuana if they're not going to go to jail? And then what falls under a small amount of marijuana?
That's a great question. So a small amount of marijuana is under 4 ounces. I'm not exactly sure how much that is, but I've heard people say that's probably around a baggie full, like a small baggie. So it's actually a pretty good amount. And they choose that number because that sort of indicates that it's probably recreational use and they're not selling it. If there's any indication that the individual is selling the marijuana, if it's packaged for sale or if they have a weight or something along those lines, officials will probably use their discretion and probably not cite them. They probably will end up arresting them for a greater charge. But going back to your original question, if an individual is stopped by a police officer and that person has less than 4 ounces of marijuana on them, the police officer can give them a ticket or give them a citation with directions of what they need to do next, rather than having to take them in and go through the magistration process and arrest them and possibly have them stay in jail for a period of time and pay a bond to get out. Instead, these individuals would have to show up for some type of either class or community service or have to pay a fine instead of actually having to go to jail.
And so there are lots of reasons why this might be a good program and why people in the community would support something like this. We'll get to more of that in a moment. But this is all just speculation. It's an idea at this point. There's a little bit more that needs to happen, which you've already mentioned. And we're going to hear a little bit about what needs to happen for this to become a reality from some audio that you recorded at that meeting earlier this week. It's audio of SAPD Chief William McManus talking with people in attendance at that meeting.
So we started these discussions on cite and release back in September of 2017. Mr. Chair, I believe you read that first meeting with the current DA, and I'm not really sure that we got anywhere with that discussion, other than me saying that the police department was on board with the cite and release program. We already do cite and release for Class C misdemeanors. This current program that we're talking about now will simply expand what we already do with Class C. The point that I have been making since we started talking about cite and release is that officer discretion is paramount to me in moving this program forward. So as long as officers have the discretion in certain circumstances to either cite and release or arrest, then we're okay with this program moving forward. There's an article in the Texas Penal Code that talks about that talks about cite and release, but the cite and release program that we're talking about will only be applicable to Bexar County residents. Anyone outside of Bexar County will not fall under will not fall under the benefits of this program. We can't do this, can't move ahead with this without complete cooperation from the district attorney-elect. Without the program being developed on the back end, on the front end we're already developed, but on the back end if it's not developed, then we can't move forward with it. I met with myself and several of my staff members met with the district attorney-elect yesterday, and we talked about the program moving forward, and we are going to move. We're going to meet again later on this month, later on next month in December, to iron out a lot of the details that are left hanging there right now. So I think we fully expect to have most of the details ironed out before he actually is sworn in on January 1st. On the front end of it, we have used the Austin model, the Austin Police Department's general manual, as a guideline for our new general manual updates. So we are in line with what Austin is doing in their cite and release program. The one thing that remains for us to do is to update our ticket books to reflect what will be required in the new cite and release program, and to release a training video on how this will actually work. There's been a lot of discussion about what identification the police department will accept when someone is stopped and being considered for cite and release. Rather than run through a list of all the different things that we would accept, I would say that as long as an officer is satisfied that the person is who he or she says they are, then we will cite and release as opposed to arrest if they are eligible for cite and release. So rather than have a long list of the matricular card, the driver's license, the library card, anything that the person can present that we can validate as being a true ID, then we will accept that as a valid ID and allow that person to participate in the cite and release program.
So once again, that was audio of San Antonio Police Department Chief William McManus giving some details on this potential cite and release program for marijuana that we're discussing on today's episode of the In-Depth podcast. So Emilie, aside from falling in line with other areas of the country, even globally, this is something that is becoming more of the norm. There's added benefit to police manpower by changing to a citation policy like this. Tell me about that.
Yes, and in fact, that's actually Chief McManus's main focus in implementing a cite and release program. The San Antonio Police Department has not kept pace with the number of police officers with the growth that San Antonio has had. So the chief says that he would rather have his police officers dedicated to violent crimes that require more manpower and require more officers, rather than have them taking an individual into the magistrate's office and going through the very complicated booking process and filling out paperwork. So he actually estimates that an officer spends on average 90 minutes to process an arrest for one of these offenses that's eligible for a cite and release program. And that amounts to 45,939 hours of officer time over the last 4.5 years since 2014. So you can see that is a really big number. And if we're dedicating those 45,000 hours to something else instead, that could definitely benefit the community.
So now I'd like to take some time to talk about the history and what kind of a change this would be if this becomes the law of the land in San Antonio. Is this going to be a big change, or is this something that kind of marks the trajectory of what's been happening for the past several years?
I think it is a big change for San Antonio. We're actually behind the curve a little bit because Austin, Houston, and Dallas already have some sort of cite and release program in place. In fact, Houston doesn't even call it a cite and release program because they don't issue a citation. There is no type of record of an arrest ever happening. It is purely wiped from your record. And, I mean, it never goes on your record in the first place. But some of these programs have been in existence for a year or two, if not longer. And San Antonio is just now catching up and starting a program. So I think this will be a big change for Bexar County, for San Antonio. We just don't know what it will look like yet. We had an idea when District Attorney LaHood started a similar program last year, and it had a lot of growing pains. The San Antonio Express-News, we obtained records from the district attorney's office that showed that they hadn't even put together a policy or finalized a policy just a couple of days before LaHood announced that this program was going to go into effect. So they called them growing pains, but there's been a lot of criticism of it. In fact, it isn't even clear if it's still being used today. In the first 2 months of the trial program, only 31 citations were issued. We'll see if it will look a little more like that or if it's going to evolve into something greater and bigger.
So that all being the case, what kind of support do you think a marijuana citation program like this would or would not receive from the public and also other officials in San Antonio?
That's another great question. I think it's going to have a lot of support. I have been going to these city council public safety meetings for about 2 years now, pretty consistently. And it's not a meeting that gets a lot of attendance. I think maybe there's only been 1 or 2 where a lot of people have shown up. And at this meeting on Tuesday, there were close to 2 dozen, if not more, activists at the meeting and individuals who said that they supported such a program. In fact, there was a man who had been arrested for making excessive calls to 911. And while that offense would not be included in a cite and release program, he outlined how a citation rather than an arrest could have dramatically changed how this case was handled. He said, this arrest had a big impact on my life. I didn't end up having to go to jail because he was released by a judge before he had to go. But still, it had a huge impact on him. And he outlined, hey, a citation program really helps people, especially if they're just making a stupid mistake for something like a low-level misdemeanor. And there also were several city council members who tentatively said they supported such a program. Councilman Cruz Shaw was probably the most passionate. He represents the District 2 on the east side, and he explained how this is the right thing to do. It's great that it saves officers time and it's great that it saves taxpayer dollars, but he said more than anything, we need to do this because it's the right thing to do. He explained, and this is what a lot of activists go into too, is that for a lot of people, if they're arrested for a low-level misdemeanor like this, if they're caught with a small amount of pot and they get sent to jail, a $200 or a $500 bond may not be a big deal. They can pay that and they can get out within a couple of hours. But for someone who's in the working class or someone who's a little down on their luck, that can be a lot of money. They may not have $200 or $500 laying around, and if they don't, if it takes them a week or if it takes them a month to gather that type of money, then they're missing work. And are their employer are they going to understand? Will they keep their job for them? Then they might lose their job. So Councilman Shaw really went into how this is the right thing to do because it's the equitable thing to do and because it makes our justice system fair.
Correct me if I'm wrong. It sounds like while you were at that meeting, there were a lot of people speaking in favor, but was there anyone against this?
Yes, there was. One member, District 10 Councilman Clayton Perry, expressed a lot of reservations. He said that he wanted to see data from other places that have implemented a cite and release program to see if it was effective there, to see if the crime increased in those neighborhoods or in those cities and counties, and also if there were repeat offenders. One thing Chief McManus has said, and he has indicated that incoming District Attorney Gonzalez feels the same way, is that they don't want repeat offenders in this program. So if you get cited under this program once, you can't do it again. That's not how it works in all counties, but that's how they have indicated that they want it to work here. And Councilman Perry has said, hey, like we need to make sure that we're not just basically giving people a slap on the wrist and then they go out and they do it again. We need to make sure that there aren't repeat offenders. He also expressed reservations about some of the crimes that are allowed to be included in a cite and release program, specifically the ones that have victims or the ones that have property damage like graffiti or theft. He said, we should allow victims to have input in this conversation, and we should allow them there should be greater retribution for those individuals. We can't just give people a slap on the wrist for a $600 theft.
And then to reiterate kind of the timeline and what's happening now versus what could happen once the new district attorney would get on board, which all indications look like that's very likely to happen. What is going on right now, and when's the earliest this change could go into place?
Right now, the incoming district attorney and Chief McManus are in conversations about what this would look on the back end. They're trying to solidify what the program would actually look like, whether a person would have to take a class or whether they'd have to pay a fine, or maybe it's a combination of those two. So they're solidifying what the program will look like, how it will work. They're probably putting together new citation books so that when they stop an individual for an offense like this, they have the paperwork that they need to fill out the citations. And they're talking about how they're going to unveil this among all of the different law enforcement agencies in Bexar County. Because, of course, it's not just the Bexar County Sheriff's Office and it's not just the San Antonio Police Department. We have dozens of police departments here in Bexar County who could all be part of this program, or perhaps it will be mandatory and they have to be part of this program. That's what they're figuring out right now. They said that they met earlier this week and that they're going to meet again in December. Mr. Gonzalez will take office on January 1st, and he's told me that his first priority is the cite and release program. So I think we should expect to see some type of announcement out of his office within maybe a few weeks or a month. I imagine that he'll try to have something to show the public of where he's heading.
And then, Emilie, before we say goodbye, there's a lot of details. I can understand how this might be confusing to someone who hasn't been following a story like this and they're just listening now. So final thoughts and a chance to maybe pinpoint something that we haven't spoken about yet.
I think moving forward, it will be really interesting to look at how other counties in Texas have done programs like this, because the 2007 state law that allows counties to implement a cite and release program allows a lot of latitude. And like I've been saying, you can choose to give someone a fine or you can choose to give someone community service or a class. So in Houston, for example, or in Harris County, if you're caught with marijuana, there is never a record of an arrest. There's simply a contract that the individual signs promising to show up for a 4-hour education class. And if they complete that education class, there's no record of the person ever being caught with marijuana. They destroyed the marijuana. The contract is not released. They complete the class and that's that. But in other counties, they handle it a lot differently throughout both here in Texas and nationally. For example, in New York, you can have up to 25 grams, and that's punishable by a summons with no criminal record. Or in Pittsburgh, there's a $25 fine, or Nashville, a $50 fine. So I think it'll be really interesting to see where Bexar County goes with this program, whether we're going to be sort of in the middle of the pack or whether we'll be very progressive like Houston. And so only time will tell.
And thank you to San Antonio Express News staff writer Emilie Eaton for those important details on today's episode of the In Depth Podcast, an interview program from expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.